All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our series of online talk hosted by the Science Student chapter. And thanks for coming again. And thanks to Dr. Gemmer for accepting to speak for us. So today, Dr. Gemmer from Wake Forest University is here to talk about why lettuce is so wrinkly and then about fractal. And it sounds like a very interesting talk. So let's let him start with no further ado, and the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I wish it could be in person, but you know, it looks like the pandemic is hopefully slowing down, being a bit optimistic. But what I want to talk about is a long project that I've been working on for over a decade now. I changed the title a little bit. I think I wrote like, why does lettuce look like a fractal? But in truth, I mean, it's really the question is, why is lettuce so wrinkly? And the reason I switched the titles is the original title, I wanted to make it sound more, I guess, mathematical. But this is a little bit more of a colloquial title, and it's kind of a colloquial talk. And I didn't want to do too much of the complexity, but just give kind of the mechanisms of what happens in something like a thin elastic sheet, where you see this beautiful pattern in this is just lettuce you could find in the grocery store. And there's clearly interesting structure that arises in this system. And before I get into a lot of the details, I just want to emphasize that you could have a teleological explanation of a phenomenon like this. You could say something like, the lettuce makes fractals to collect water the best, or maybe it collects sunlight the best. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But even if that is true, it should emerge from some fundamental physical mechanisms. So that's really what this talk is about. It's not saying something like, I'm going to look at like the fractal patterns and measure the self-similarity. I'm going to try to see how these patterns can emerge from the fundamental physics of elastic sheets. So this is joint work with Shankar Venkataramani, was my PhD advisor at University of Arizona. So this project this started in about 2008. And we're still working on different aspects of this, and we just published a paper recently. I have an experimental collaborator, Ron Sharon, who works at the Hebrew University of Israel. Toby Shearman used to be a student, is now working at Conversant, which is a company in the Chicago area. Ken Yamamoto is at Southern Methodist, and Eric Struckmeyer is an undergraduate student at University of Arizona. And this work has been partially funded. Some of this work I'm going to present was done during my sabbatical, which was funded by the University of Chicago, the American Institute of Mathematics, the Mathematics Climate Research Network. Okay, so the talk itself, I want to begin with just kind of like simple things. So an observation of what is the difference between something that arises in nature versus something that is man-made. And the two pictures I have, one is just the skyline of the city. And what you can see is everything has these nice lines, there's nice angles, and it's kind of built out of systems of really rectangles and triangles. While in nature, we see something that is, well, it somehow seems more natural. This is a sea slug, and we see this kind of rippling pattern along the edge. And the other thing that is different about stuff that many of the material that rises in nature is it's much softer. So that means it's more pliable to soft forces. Okay. So other examples, this is a human replication of something like the coral, right? And so it kind of mimics what we observe naturally, but you can still see that this is really a man-made thing. There's a lot of imperfections. And that's because when we try to cast something, that's how these are made in like a mold, is we can't get down to the small scale structures that nature does. Similarly, if we could try to replicate a squirrel, we could just use origami. So we could take some sheets of paper, bend the sheets of paper, and we get a squirrel pattern. Okay. And a microchip is next example of something that's man-made. We've really insisted when we make a microchip that we're using kind of this discrete geometry of squares and lines. Okay. However, if we think of, and maybe it's not a good analogy, but if we think of the human brain as somewhat like a computer, its architecture is vastly different, right? Somehow nature has built in all this wrinkling into itself, and it clearly is very different linkage structure than a microprocessor. So one of the things that I want to try to get to in this talk is, why does this occur? Energetically, what are the physical mechanisms? And then maybe what are the benefits of doing these things that have like these wrinkly shapes versus kind of the natural geometry that we work with, which is kind of this flat geometry. So I'm going to just discuss a little bit about origami, just to kind of start a brief discussion about thin elastic sheets. So origami, one way to think about it is maps. So if I take the Paris city map and I just begin using it. So I know this is a bit of a dated analogy. I don't really use maps anymore. I use GPS for everything. But if I take this map and I use it continuously, what happens to it? Anybody, and this might be only to the older generation, what happens if you use a map over and over again?
It breaks.
Yeah. I mean, so I still have my maps in my car and they're just a mess. This is what they all look like, right? And one of the reasons for this is when we make these maps, we make these folds at all 90 degrees. The problem with that is when you try to put them back together, you have to, when you try to refold it, you have to figure out, okay, I know they're all 90 degrees, but do I fold it left or do I fold it right? And if you screw up one, the whole thing propagates. So a better idea that's more clever is actually not to constrain ourselves to 90 degrees. And it's amazing how long it took to invent this. But this is an amazing invention by a Japanese scientist. He's a scientist trying to figure out how to best deploy solar sails. But what ends up happening is he said, why don't we just bend these angles a little bit? And if we do that, you get a much better folding pattern. So this, I've never been to Japan, but what I've heard is if you take the subway, this is how they distribute their subway maps. And it's an extremely simple process, right? So the reason I wanted to put this in was to highlight maybe our kind of thought process where we're so invested in like 90 degrees and these right angle symmetries that we're really hindering progress in some other areas. So this very simple idea has these applications to this very simple fold, right? It's a simple idea. And the interesting thing about origami is it's very algorithmic. It's a very easy process to program into a computer. So you could take a pattern, you could lay down all these fold patterns. And if you tell a computer or a robot to fold this thing, an object can come out, right? And if I actually follow these patterns, I get a spider out of this. Who knew? I can't look at this thing and see that, right? But this is interesting. I mean, there's this clear, interesting symmetry patterns everywhere, all over this square diagram, and out comes this object, right? So there's emergent phenomenon from incredibly simple rules, just mountain versus valley folds, okay? If you want, there's a really good TED talk on this by Robert Lang, where he talks about a lot of the mathematics of origami. But again, this rules for this emergent structure comes from discrete geometry. So this is not just like a simple or a kind of a silly problem of art. This has applications. So for example, stents use this type of folding properties. I mentioned solar sails earlier. Here's a simulation of what's known as the star shade, a solar sail they've been developing at Caltech. And its amazing idea is where you take these thin sails and you're able to confine it into a small area. And because the sheet is so thin, it can undo the folding pattern and give you this solar sail. Okay. Same technology is used in something like an airbag. The airbag is a simple idea. You just want something that has a big volume, but filled with air, so it lowers your impact. But that means you have to be able to stuff something into a small space. Okay. And they're also used, this exact same patterns are now used in shields for riot police. They're just deployable to a location. Very lightweight. So this is like a Kevlar origami shield. Okay. So let me discuss a little bit about the math of this, and I don't want to go too deep into it because it's a pretty hard problem. It's one of those problems where you really have to sit down. So I don't want to go through the gory details, but I want to give you the intuition of what's going on in thin elastic sheets. So the basic principle of thin elastic sheets is stretching is really hard. So this is an example of this person pulling on a rubber sheet. You have to put some real force into it. And you can see this with paper. If you try to really stretch on paper, it's very hard. However, bending is very easy. And so this is an example of somebody just holding a piece of paper. Gravity is a pretty weak force, and it's able to bend this thing downward. Okay. So that's really the basic physics of thin elastic sheets. We have to define what we really mean by stretching. That can get a bit tricky, but it's the competition between these two effects that govern the emergent phenomenon. So a proxy for the type of functional that could modify or model this phenomenon is given below. And I want to talk about the terms a little bit because this is the actual, even though I'll do harder problems, this is the base problem that governs all of the intuition for this system. So there's three terms in this functional, and then there's also three corresponding physical parameters, delta and epsilon. So this first term is a proxy for gravitational forces. So F is a model for like the height of the sheet. So this is just penalizing the sheet from leaving the horizontal, and that's it. And I know it's a little bit weird. I'm taking the square curvature. I just do that to make the problem easier, or the square of the function. The second term is what's known as the stretching energy. So if I think about this term physically, the derivative, which measures the slope, this df dx square term really comes up as an arc length. So if you do an arc length integral, this is a measurement of local distortions of length. And this -1 is a deviation of the lengths being preserving Pythagorean's theorem. So this basically, all this does tell you is how far am I away from actually being flat. Okay. This final term, which measures the second derivatives, this is what's measuring the curvature of the sheet. Okay. And that's it. So that's the entire physical model of the sheet. And it's kind of, it's easy to write down. However, if you've taken a class in calculus of variations, or you've seen this stuff a little bit, the first thing you might try to do is calculate the Euler-Lagrange equations for this. The challenge with this is you're going to get a fourth order, highly nonlinear boundary value problem. And it's not easy to solve because the bending being easy, it's going to mean you're going to have a small parameter in this epsilon. And if gravity is also weak, you have another small problem, or small parameter in delta. So if you look at the Euler-Lagrange equations for the system, you're going to get a singular perturbation problem with two small scales. Those are really tricky to analyze. An alternative approach is to make a good guess and prove that your guess is correct. So the guess for this system is to say, okay, the sheet wants to not stretch. So I'm just going to find solutions that set this term equal to 0. So those are curves that have slope plus or minus 1 almost everywhere. And those are these type of triangular shapes. Okay, so this would be a curve that has 0 stretching, except maybe in a little tip region. And in the lingo of this field, we call these defects because they're not exactly perfect because of these tips, these singularities. Okay, but what you can do, I'm not going to go through the details of it, but you can actually estimate the energy that's concentrated on these tips. And you get a precise scaling law for this energy as a function of the number of tips. And if you optimize over this, you get a scaling law. Okay, you have to prove this rigorously. The rigorous way to do this is something called gamma limits. But this is the intuition of the problem, is you rigorously prove this to good guess. And if you can do that, you get the precise scaling law for the number of triangles as a function of the small parameters. So this is kind of the math behind it. And this is hopefully the most technical slide on this. But let's talk about how this actually manifests in real sheets. So usually in person, I do this demonstration. But if you take a sheet of paper and just put stacks of quarters at the end and you hang it over the edge, what happens is the sheet just curls down. And the reason it does that is it does not want to stretch at all. So it's going to bend under the gravity without stretching. Okay. Now, there's an interesting effect, though. If I take this middle stack of quarters, keep that one on top, but now put the uppermost stack and the lowermost stack underneath the sheet, and now do the exact same experiment, the entire sheet gets weighted. Is in equilibrium without falling. So the difference here in these two experiments is because of this slight disturbance that I put in with these stacks of quarters, I'm not allowing the sheet to bend without stretching. So this small change in the geometry of the sheet allows this thing to support it against gravity, because if it did try to fall down, it would induce stretching. Okay, so this is one effect of of pieces of paper or thin elastic sheets, is surprisingly small changes in the geometry leads to rigidity. You can also see this in what's known as crumpling experiments. So this is a cartoon diagram of a piece of paper inside of the palm of your hand. And if you compress the piece of paper, what you get is a crumpled piece of paper. Okay, that's not surprising. We all know this. But if we actually really look at this crumpled piece of paper, what it is, it's actually still essentially flat everywhere except on these defects. So you'll see this concentration of stretching energy along networks of ridges. And these ridges meet at like these little conical points. So geometrically, the sheet is still considered flat, but now it's not a smooth sheet anymore. And all this, the stretching energy gets concentrated in these ridges. So this is not, I mean, yeah, we do this with pieces of paper because it's low cost. But this type of energetic effects of generating patterns and concentration of energy arises in different contexts. So in this example, this is microstructure of martensite austenite alloy. It's a shape memory alloy. And because of the two different types of energy in the system, you can get different patterns at the microstructure level. Okay, and this just changes the property of the material itself. Okay, so I just want to do some observations about like the techniques I've been doing before I jump in now to hyperbolic geometry. So the key things in trying to analyze this type of variational problems is there's competition between different energies in the system. And like when you do a singular perturbation problem, you try to split the problem into different regimes. solve local problems and patch them together. That's kind of what we do here, except we minimize different pieces of the functional and patch them together. And so these are simple differential equations that we solve, which are really going to give the correct pattern. And then knowing how these patterns really partition the energy, that really boils down to solving a discrete optimization problem. And that's one of the keys, is this energy by itself is very hard to directly minimize. But by appropriately computing the gamma limit, we get easier functionals to analyze. The big picture of what we're doing is we have developed rigorous asymptotic approximations to these fourth order nonlinear differential equations. This is not trivial. If you've worked with fourth order boundary value problems, they have biharmonic terms. You don't have a maximum principle. There's a lot of the typical analytical tools that aren't there to help us. Also, by computing these limiting functionals, you get a very easy discrete numerical algorithm, not a continuous algorithm like solving a partial differential equation, but a discrete problem to solve. And the biggest picture is this is actually really similar to techniques used in hyperbolic systems known as the viscosity method for regularizing shocks in something like the Berger's equation, where you take a small scale effect and then rigorously compute the limit as you take that small scale effect going to zero. Okay, so I want to give an interlude though, because when I was a student and I would go to talks sometimes, I would see a lot of the mathematical theory, and then I would step back and I would say, okay, but I know we have really good numerical computations. Couldn't we just simulate this? And the reason I want to do this theorem, so first of all, this theorem is wrong. So please don't turn off the recording and throw me out. I know this is wrong, but I'm still going to provide a proof for it because it's illustrative of some of the problems that can occur. Okay, so if I want to prove square root of 2 equals 2, if you've seen this before, it's kind of a cute proof. The idea is I can just draw this triangle with length 1, 1, square root of 2. And what I can do is draw a staircase for it. And this function f1 has the length of 2, because all I did was take the original two sides of this triangle and move them into this location of the red curve. Okay, so f1 is this red curve and its length is 2. Great. So I do this again, I get a green curve and its length is 2. Okay, so I keep doing this. I get f3, that length of that is 2, and I take the limit. And so in the limit, I get this line, and I take the limit on the right-hand side. And that limit's easy to compute. It's just 2. So the length of this line is 2. Okay. And that's it, right? So that's the proof. Anybody want to take a stab at what I did wrong? Whoops. Oops. And you don't have to. It's actually kind of a tricky problem. And we know it's wrong. But the reason I do this is I imagine this kind of like a numerical algorithm. On the right-hand side, I can imagine these are numerical approximations, and I take a limit. Maybe this is a limit on the data that we're getting, right? And so I assume the limit is 2, okay? And this limiting process gives me these limiting objects, so I'm comparing across this. The issue is the operation isn't continuous, so I'm really just putting the limit inside something. But in many cases, we kind of think of numerics doing this. The issue is these curves aren't really smooth. The mode of convergence isn't really strong convergence, it's weak convergence. And you have to be careful with nonlinear operations with weak convergence, right? So this is the type of phenomenon that occurs in variational problems all the time, is we only get weak convergence. And what we can't expect the value of the functionals to converge. And this is the problem with many numerical techniques for this particular problem, is we know the minimizers might not be smooth. They might have weak irregularity, so we can't expect some of the standard numerical techniques to actually give us the correct answer. Okay. So I want to talk in the last minutes about the main theme, which is actually then buckling in nature and how does it arise. So these are examples of the hyperbolic geometry. So this is different than flat sheets. Flat sheets, if I look at the local geometry, well, it's flat. These are curved intrinsically. So I really like this quote by Margaret. It does capture kind of the beginning themes of the talk, but it is that outside our boxes, nature teems with frilly crenellated forms, from the fluted surfaces of lettuce and fungi to the frilled skirts of sea slugs and the gorgeous undulations of corals. These organisms are biological manifestations of what we call hyperbolic geometry. And so I want to give a little bit of a discussion of what hyperbolic geometry is, but not the gory details of it. So first, there's two notions of geometry, and we're going to have to parse them to understand a little bit about why lettuce is so wrinkly. And the first notion is intrinsic geometry. So this is the type of geometry that you can deduce from properties you can measure on the surface alone. And so there's always this analogy in geometry books where if you take a bug walking on a surface, so this is a picture of ants walking on a Mobius strip. And so the idea of intrinsic geometry is things like area, angles, lengths. That's something an insect could measure. They could, well, I guess they're not really smart enough, but if they're bright enough, they could measure. They could pull out a measuring tape and measure these things, right? Extrinsic geometry is different. Extrinsic geometry is things that we would notice if we were outside of the surface. So these would be things, if we think in terms of vectors, vector components that would be normal to the surface. And I put this kind of, I forget these are in baseball, they call them tampers, which is tamping the ground down. This is a good way of just measuring the normal to a surface. Okay. So why is there this distinction? Intrinsic properties are kind of the natural physical things to measure on a surface. So like I said before, one of them is length. So if I take a surface that's flat, or a sheet of paper that's flat, and I have draw this proof of Pythagorean's theorem, and I just bend it with no stretching, the lengths are preserved. We even teach this in middle school, high school, elementary school. We do things like, how do you measure the length on a cylinder or something? We imagine, oh, what if we unwrapped it and then just measured its length? We could do that. However, we can't do that with something like a sphere. A sphere has a fundamentally different geometry. So if we tried to cut and flatten it, there would be stretching and the lengths would be distorted. Okay. Bending is an extrinsic property. So intrinsic properties which measure length, that would be something our stretching energy is going to be an intrinsic property of the surface, while the bending of the sheet is going to be extrinsic because you're really leaving, you're moving in the third dimension. So the way bending is measured is through the two principal curvatures. So this is kind of a cartoon diagram if you've got them, but the principal curvatures are just the max and mins of the curvature of curves through points. Okay. So the interesting thing about curvature is there's one version of the curvature that is intrinsic, which is the Gaussian curvature. And it's a very clever idea by Gauss, which is, how do you measure how curved a surface is if you can't leave the surface? And the version I'm presenting of his idea is to say, okay, what if I took a pole where I'm located, tied like a piece of rope around myself, walked out until the rope was taut, and then just walked in a circle? And if I do that, I can measure the circumference of that circle. And it turns out if you're on a sphere, that circumference is actually going to be less than 2 pi r because the surface bends downward. While if you're on a saddle-shaped surface, it's going to be greater than 2 pi r because you go up these hills and down these hills. So you actually walk a longer distance. And Gauss's idea was to measure the discrepancy of this between being a regular circle and what we're actually measuring and taking a limit. Okay, so this is the actual way. You can measure the curvature of the surface this way. And this is well, I'd say it's a really easy way, but it's a way to prove flat earthers wrong. It's just measure the circumference. It's going to be less than 2 pi r. Okay, so what I want to understand then, if I want to understand how hyperbolic geometry emerges in nature, I'm going to put in a toy problem, which is, can we find hyperbolic geometries that have constant negative Gaussian curvature? So these are these saddle shapes. Okay. It's actually a very classic problem, and it was studied actually by Hilbert. And one of his main results is that if you just try to solve the underlying PDEs for this problem, and if you only care about smooth solutions, what you'll get is singularities on these surfaces. And so this is the classic example of a hyperbolic plane embedded in 3 dimensions, the pseudosphere. And what you see is a kink on the sheet. Okay. And you see this in any other you could give different initial data to that PDE and generate different surfaces. And no matter what you do, you will generate these kinks in the surface. So from the elastic perspective, this is a problem. These kinks are going to have massive bending energy because the second derivative is divergent on all of these. I mean, this is a really extreme thing to ask a sheet to do this. Okay, so the question is, given that this is the fundamental restriction of hyperbolic geometry, why in the world in nature do we observe more regular surfaces? We don't see these kinks emerging in things like sea slugs and lettuce. Okay. So the natural question is, how does nature actually solve this problem? Given there's this singular sheet, but if you actually go out and measure something like the Gaussian curvature of this flower, it'll be roughly negative. But if you look at something like a daffodil, instead of forming this kink, it does something quite amazing. It forms these riffled patterns. So somehow nature gets around this singular edge. Okay. There's a quote about this, about like why nature can just do what it wants. So it's, life cannot be contained, life breaks free, life finds a way. Does anybody know what this quote is from or who it's from?
Yeah, it's from Jurassic Park.
Very good. That's really good, because I'm always worried that I've been using this quote for a while, and I'm always worried that at some point nobody's going to know. But this is from Jurassic Park, right? This movie is funny because this guy's supposed to be a chaos theorist, which I'm not really sure what that is. But it is kind of a principle that nature is not really restricted by our mathematical results in some sense. And I'll show what I mean by that. Of course, it's constrained by the physics, and the physics and math are connected, but it does find some way energetically to make this pattern. Okay. So I should talk a little bit about the model that I'm going to use to actually study this. And it's exactly the problem or exactly the framework for standard thin elastic sheets. The issue is I'm going to have to work in a Riemannian geometry. And the idea is that a growing sheet is going to distort lengths between points. This happens for a number of reasons, but predominantly the cells near the periphery of something like a leaf with ripples, the cells are growing faster near the edge than the interior. There's genetic mechanisms for this. There's a hormone named auxin that kind of induces this in a leaf. But the effect of it is the perimeter of the edge of the disk is going to be larger than 2 pi r. So it's going to induce hyperbolic geometry. Okay. So when that occurs, the idea is the sheet is then going to deform in 3 dimensions to try to make these lengths as close as possible to what the interior of the sheet wants. Okay. So I'm just going to build this into an elastic model. So before, when I talked about the 1D thin elastic sheets, this G here was just a 1. In higher dimensions, this is just the identity matrix. However, for flat sheets, it's the identity matrix. So for a growing sheet, I replace the identity by the Riemannian metric. And so this is going to be a measurement of the internal strain of the sheet. Okay. And then on top of this, I'm going to put a bending energy term. It's the same thing as the square of the curvatures. And this T is the thickness of the sheet. So for very thin sheets, this is the analogy of stretching is going to be very strong compared to bending. Okay. And just like when we did the 1D sheets, I'm going to try to restrict this problem by imposing that I solve this system of PDEs, which is my 0 stretching condition, and geometry, this is known as an isometric immersion. I'm going to try to minimize the bending energy over this constraint. Okay. And again, there's a technique for proving this rigorously to gamma convergence, but this is the essential idea, is minimize the bending energy subject to this constraint, and that's it. Okay. Just to show you a little bit of the experimental. It's not that nature is doing anything really exotic. Like, this type of model can capture the underlying physics. This is Eran Sharon's work, where he looks at growing hydrogel disks, and in a computer he can carefully program the swelling at different locations, and he can impose a constant Gaussian curvature, and you do get these saddle-like shapes. Okay, I mean, and he does it a lot more precise. He can measure the curvatures and everything. This idea is also being used in that to say it's in reverse to grow objects in 3D. So to take something like a flat sheet and grow it into a planet. Okay. All right. And these are other results from his lab. Okay. So experimentally, what we notice when we try to mimic growth is we get what we kind of expect. This saddle shape is a hydrogel disk with a constant negative Gaussian curvature. The interesting thing is when I make it thinner, I get more and more of these kind of ripples. This is a little bit surprising in that when you get thinner and thinner, that means the stretching gets more and more dominant. So in that case, it's breaking the symmetry of the saddle shape to give you more complicated patterns. We also notice this in crocheted models of the hyperbolic plane. If you start with a saddle shape and begin growing it, it begins to get more and more complicated the larger it gets. And the reason for this at the kind of heuristic level is as we grow this sheet, it's going to get closer and closer to that singular edge that Hilbert discussed, and it's going to have to somehow get around that. So we can also see this in torn elastic sheets. So this is an experiment. If you take a trash bag and tear along its edge, it'll generate like these fractal patterns. And this is similar to what we notice in something like a beet leaf. And in these cases, so a beet leaf, what this diagram is measuring is the discrepancy in the growth near the edge of the sheet, near 0, versus the near the rib of the sheet. And so there's a lot of growth near the edge of the sheet, and that induces these buckling patterns. So I'm going to go through a rough idea of how we can actually resolve this issue. And the idea is to take the key idea is to take some of the concepts from origami and see how we can generalize them to hyperbolic geometry. So if I actually want to solve the isometry equations, to lowest order, the equation is a Monge-Ampere partial differential equation. Okay. These equations are notoriously hard, even numerically. But if I assume the Gaussian curvature is constant, so if I just plug in -1, I can actually solve these equations explicitly. It's just given by this whole one parameter family of quadratic solutions. Okay. So the interesting thing about these solutions is they're always saddle shaped, as we would expect. But if I pick this angle just right, I can construct another class of solutions. The idea is I know this surface is bounded between two straight lines. I can cut off a piece of this surface and make periodic reflections, and I get a new surface. Okay. The price I pay for this is not a smooth solution to the equation. It's a weak solution. So it's not going to, the second derivatives are not going to satisfy this equation everywhere because second derivatives don't exist. But everywhere else it does. Okay. So this is a weak solution. You can think of it as like a distributional solution to the problem. Okay. So the interesting thing about this is that technique where I just looked at that one point and I kind of tail expanded the whole problem to lowest order and found that solution. You could do this generically anywhere on a hyperbolic sheet. So for instance, the pictures on the right is I could have picked this point. I could have done the exact same process, found other solutions to the Monge-Ampere equation, and as long as I get the boundary conditions right, I can glue them together into making this sheet. Okay. So this idea gives a natural framework for how do I get around that problem of near the edge of the sheet, maybe the principal curvatures are diverging, is I can take other solutions to the problem and patch them together. There is going to be a defect right at that green point. You have to be careful about that. The regularity is C11, but it is square integrable. Okay. Okay, and so this is a numerical experiment of just showing these different shapes and how they arise. In this linearized setting, the saddle shape is always the lowest energy shape, and I'm coloring these by the Gaussian curvature. So in the linearized setting, you're not going to see these higher order wavy shapes. If I now go back though, so what I did in that previous construction was I just solved the linearized problem. I didn't put in the entire geometry, the hyperbolic plane, and account for the energy of those defects throughout the sheet. To do this, the hyperbolic hyperbolic geometry has a nice parameterization in terms of the angles between the asymptotic curves of a surface. If I choose this parameterization, all of the geometric quantities can be put into the angles between these coordinate lines. And it's just a classical result that these coordinate lines satisfy the Sine-Gordon equation. So this is the nonlinear analog of the Monge-Ampere equation for the angles. This is the equation that will actually generate solutions to the full isometry problem. And I can put the bending energy in terms of entirely this angle. The key thing is this angle, if it's ever 0 or pi, this energy diverges. And we see this exactly on the singular edge along the pseudosphere. It's exactly where the coordinate curves begin to flatten. So by converting it to this problem of solving a Sine-Gordon equation, I can actually now just minimize this bending energy subject to the constraint that solves now this PDE. Okay. I won't go through the details, but this is the idea of generating this surface. This is the nonlinear analog of the previous surfaces I had, where this is a solution to the Sine-Gordon equation. And these ridges, these are exactly where the bending energy diverges. But near the center of this disk, I can do the exact same periodic reflections to generate piecewise smooth isometric inversions. Okay, and these solve the full geometrical problem, no approximations. And the interesting thing is how they concentrate energy. So near the edge of the sheet, you're seeing the principal curvatures diverge. That's what we expect from Hilbert's theorem. But I could make it more wavy, and that allows the disk to grow a little bit larger. And I can just keep doing this process. The price I pay is more energy near the center of the disk. So this is a movie of just the sheet growing and bifurcating between these two different, or between these multiple wave solutions. And what you're seeing is the principal curvatures begin diverging, and then it just reflects into the other geometries. So, yeah, and the number of waves grows exponentially. So you can actually prove this. The energy of these piecewise smooth solutions is lower than the smooth solutions. So this black curve is minimizing over smooth solutions, and these curves here are actually the piecewise solutions. Okay. So it does do better. And it matches qualitatively what we saw in our experiments. So this does seem like the right mechanism. However, if I look at these sheets, it's a weird thing I did. I'm making it bifurcate near the origin, and I'm adding a lot of energy in the interior. It seems like it'd be better if I could put a defect near the edge. And to do that, we have to extend what was done for the when I did the Taylor series near the origin. Okay. I don't want to go through the details too much of this, but the essential idea is to take the full equations for a surface in 3 dimensions. They're a system of partial differential equations. They're hyperbolic. And I'm going to discretize this onto a grid. And I'm going to solve this equation on the grid, and I'm going to allow patching at different points. So I'm just going to generalize the rules I did at the origin to allow further bifurcations out in the exterior of the sheet. Okay. So it's actually incredibly easy to do this. Even though it seems complicated and the PDEs look really hard, you just lay down a grid, solve locally on each grid, and then you put in some kind of separate grid in the interior that has different solutions to the governing equation. And you just impose on the boundary conditions that they agree, their tangents agree. So if we do this, you get these interesting looking geometries that also look much more like our sea slug. So these are getting closer to what is observed in nature. Okay. So what we've really been doing then with this algorithm is like a hyperbolic origami. We essentially take some kind of description of how I'm going to glue together local cells. And then in the interior of the cell, I can figure out the response of the sheet given that kind of skeleton. And that gives me the shape in 3 dimensions. The same thing down here. And interestingly, I could do more exotic shapes, which will generate more exotic behavior, something similar, more similar to a daffodil. The other interesting thing about this construction, we can prove this, is they have not just less energy, but far less energy than the smooth isometries. So what this means is there's an actual energy gap between the smooth isometries and the C11 isometries. And from an analysis perspective, this is really a statement about density of solutions. So if I just take this problem and plug it into a standard finite element simulator, and if it assumes smooth isometries, it's going to pick up energy scalings on this level. But what we're saying is they will never even come close to the energy scalings that we see with the C11 isometries. So we won't even be able to approximate by a traditional finite element solver any of the actual behavior that we'd expect. There's no way to get it using the standard finite elements. And this is just kind of a numerical plot of actually showing how much lower these solutions are. These are the branch solutions versus the various smooth solutions. Okay, I'm a little bit out of time, so I just want to show a picture of for the sheet geometry. So this is showing the picture for a torn trash bag. We can do the exact same thing. So this, in this case, the Gaussian curvature is not constant. So it's a little bit harder to do this patching, but the same idea holds. I'm coloring the sheet by essentially the bending energy. And you can put in these defects. And when you do that, it drastically lowers the energy in this region. And they begin growing. And then they again hit a region where Hilbert's theorem starts to take over. The principal curvatures diverge. So I put in another defect to lower the energy. And that's it. And you can view this as a numerical algorithm, a discrete numerical algorithm, which would be how many points do I lay down? Where do I lay them down to lower the energy? And doing this, you get drastically lower energy. So the blue energy is the energy of smooth solutions. So these are the typical one wave profiles. And then if you put in these fractal-like defects, you can see the energy drastically lower. And then you keep doing this and it keeps getting lower. Okay. All right. So I'll comment on a little bit of this and then I'll stop. But what we're thinking and started working on a little bit is we have these rules for how the branch points can lower energy. We now want to understand the kinematics of the disk itself. So how could something like a sea slug move and change these defects and change its geometry to actually swim underwater? And the idea is that moving these defects, they have so much lower energy than their smooth isometries. This is not like a sheet of paper where those defects cost a lot of energy. It's actually the opposite. They're very floppy. So it's actually very easy for these marine invertebrates to change their geometry. And we're still trying to figure out how to actually couple this with fluids, but this is how we would expect something to swim. Okay. All right, so I just want to summarize. It's a lot. It's kind of a whirlwind tour of all these results, but the fundamental question was, why is lettuce wrinkly? And there's three takeaways that I want you all to have. One is, well, lettuce really has a hyperbolic geometry. Hyperbolic geometry is more complicated, but there are certain class of hyperbolic geometries which have singularities, which I'm calling branch points, and they meet together in lines of inflection. This is really like a hyperbolic origami. You can it's kind of like a dual problem. You could put down on a domain where you want the branch points and the lines of inflection, and that generates the surface itself. Okay. This construction is very easy. It's very flexible and has very low energy. So hyperbolic sheets are very floppy. That's why when you go to the grocery store and you pick up a piece of lettuce, and you look at the cascade of wrinkles, they just move around very easily. The mathematical reason, and might be the most important, is these low energy minimizers are not dense in the space of smooth functions. And so they really can't be approximated by our smooth solutions. And so this result of Hilbert, where we have these divergence of the bending content, the way the sheet gets around it is by realizing the exact regularity that keeps the bending energy finite, but then also allows you to propagate beyond those singularities. All right. Well, thank you for listening to me on a July morning.
Let's join me in thanking Dr. Gemmer for this very entertaining talk.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type them in the chat.
Oh, there's a chat.
Yeah, I can read them out for you if you cannot see them because you're sharing your screen.
Yeah.
So I had one question. So you said that paper is too rigid to be reproducing those movements, but have you been looking at potential synthetic material that could have the same properties?
Thin shells also have the same problem. So a shell is when you make a shell, you cast it. And so like think of like an eggshell is a good example of this. An eggshell is spherical. And if I think about it energetically, the eggshell wants to remain spherical. So if I like poke a hole in it or pull an egg apart, it makes like two round objects. The difference with a soft material like the hyperbolic plane or these sheets is they're not cast as shells in the sense that they're not put into a mold. Well, if you cut these things, they actually deform further. And the difference energetically is in something like a shell, they have an intrinsic bending content. So not only is there a stretching energy measuring deviations from a Riemannian geometry, the bending energy measures differences from the principal curvatures. And so this is actually what I think is really interesting about the hyperbolic geometry case and these thin elastic sheets, especially for these underwater creatures, is it's because they're funnily not Euclidean, they're not shells, which actually allows them this freedom. If they were shell-like, they wouldn't be able to move as easily those branch points around. It would cost a tremendous amount of energy.
Okay, so I see that it's not very feasible to reproduce it, but we have in our portfolio and what we have access to in terms of material.
Well, that's the thing. It's kind of my collaborators want to do it the other way. We want to think where they're using biology to inspire new materials, so that this is kind of goes back to the beginning of the talk where I was thinking about like man-made versus natural. Yeah. Man-made makes things very rigid, so like a skyscraper, and that's a good thing. You don't want your skyscraper to be floppy. So that is a very rigid object, and so it can't bend. But nature, because of how it grows, it's a very different selection. It's all intrinsic geometry. It can't control anything extrinsically like we can. So anyway, the collaborators are really like, how can we mimic this to grow really smart, soft robots? So like little swimming manta ray or something made out of hyperbolic, or these hydrogel discs. And they're really mimicking the process that biology is selected.
Thank you for answering. Are there any other questions?